in the sprawling, picturesque landscapes of Colorado, where the Rocky Mountains cast long shadows over rapidly expanding suburbs. The promise of the American dream often takes the form of a manicured lawn and a spacious home. In 2018, the town of Frederick, situated just north of Denver, was the epitome of this suburban ideal. It was a place where families moved to build futures, safe in the knowledge that they were part of a thriving, quiet community. Among the residents were the Watts family, living in a large 5-bedroom home at 2825 Saratoga Trail. To the outside world, and certainly through the lens of social media, they were the picture of perfection. But as investigators would soon discover, the facade of a perfect life can sometimes hide a darkness so profound that it defies all logic and human empathy. This is an examination of the investigation into the disappearance and murder of Shanann Watts, her 2 young daughters, Bella and Celeste, and her unborn son, Nico. It is a case that unraveled not through a single smoking gun, but through a cascade of digital footprints, forensic contradictions, and the relentless intuition of law enforcement. The story begins in the early hours of August 13th, 2018. It was a Monday, the kind of routine morning that usually signals the start of a busy work week. Shanann Watts, 34 years old and 15 weeks pregnant, had just returned from a business trip in Arizona. She was dropped off at her home at approximately 1:48 a.m. by her friend and colleague, Nickole Atkinson. The 2 women had spent the weekend at a conference, and despite the late hour, the mood was one of exhaustion but normalcy. So Nickole watched Shanann enter the house, the door clicking shut behind her. It was the last time anyone other than her husband would see her alive. The alarm was raised not by a family member, but by Nickole Atkinson herself. As the sun rose and the morning progressed, a silence fell over the digital channels that Shanann usually dominated. Shanann was a woman who lived her life out loud. She was constantly connected, texting friends, posting updates, and managing her business through her phone. When she failed to attend a scheduled obstetrics appointment that morning and did not respond to multiple calls and text messages, Nickole knew something was wrong. This was not merely a missed appointment. It was a deviation from a deeply ingrained pattern of behavior. By midday, Nickole's concern had escalated to panic. She drove to the Watts residence, finding Shanann's car parked in the garage and her shoes visible near the front door. She rang the doorbell and knocked repeatedly, but the house remained silent. Trusting her instincts, she called the police to request a welfare check, a decision that likely accelerated the timeline of the investigation by days, if not weeks. Officer Coonrod of the Frederick Police Department arrived at the scene shortly after 1:30 p.m. His body-worn camera was active, capturing footage that would later be analyzed by millions of people around the world. The footage shows a quiet suburban street, the sun shining brightly, contrasting sharply with the growing tension. Chris Watts, Shanann's husband, arrived moments later, driving his work truck. He appeared calm, perhaps too calm, whereas he walked toward the officer and Nickole. He explained that he had been at work and that Shanann had likely gone to a friend's house with the children, 4-year-old Bella and 3-year-old Celeste. As Chris unlocked the front door and allowed the officer and Nickole inside, the atmosphere shifted. The house was immaculate, yet hauntingly still. Shanann's purse was found in the kitchen. Her medication, essential for her lupus and her pregnancy, was still there. Her phone was discovered between the cushions of a sofa upstairs. For any seasoned investigator, these are immediate red flags. A pregnant mother does not vanish voluntarily without her phone, her wallet, her car, or her children's car seats. Nor the narrative Chris was attempting to weave, that Shanann had taken the girls and left after an emotional conversation about their marriage, was already crumbling under the weight of physical reality. The behavior of Chris Watts in those initial hours has become a case study in forensic psychology. On the body camera footage, he is seen pacing, checking his phone, and avoiding direct eye contact with Nickole, who was visibly distraught. While Nickole was frantic, suggesting looking at neighbors' cameras and calling hospitals, Chris remained detached, offering vague theories about where she might be. He did not cry. He did not shout. He simply existed in the space, acting the part of a confused husband, but failing to convey the visceral fear that accompanies the disappearance of one's entire family. Then one of the most critical pieces of early evidence came from a neighbor, Nate Trinastic. Nate had a surveillance camera that pointed directly at the Watts driveway. When the police and Chris went next door to view the footage, the camera captured a moment of revealing body language. The surveillance video from that morning showed Chris backing his work truck up to the garage door at 5:17 a.m., something he rarely did. It showed him loading items into the truck. Crucially, it never showed Shanann or the children leaving the house on foot or in a vehicle. The only person to leave 2,825 Saratoga Trail that morning was Chris Watts. As they watched the footage on the neighbor's television, the police body camera recorded Chris's reaction. He put his hands on his head, he swayed back and forth, and he began to ramble nervously. He was physically manifesting the stress of a man whose story was being dismantled in real time. By the following day, the case had garnered national media attention. Chris Watts stood on his front porch and gave interviews to local news stations. In these interviews, he pleaded for his family's return. He looked directly into the camera and spoke about how quiet the house was, how he missed the noise of the children. To the untrained eye, he might have looked like a grieving father. But to behavior analysts and law enforcement professionals, the interviews were riddled with deception. He spoke of his family in the past tense. He offered no specific pleas to Shanann, but rather generalized statements. He exhibited what is sometimes called duping delight, a subtle, almost imperceptible smirk that can appear when a deceptive person feels they are successfully manipulating their audience. He hugged himself tightly, a defensive posture creating a physical barrier between himself and the questions. While Chris was performing for the cameras, the Frederick Police Department, assisted by the Colorado Bureau of Investigation and the FBI, was dismantling his life with surgical precision. This investigation highlights the power of modern digital forensics. In the 21st century, it is nearly impossible to commit a crime without leaving a digital trace, and Chris Watts had left a mountain of them. Investigators subpoenaed the GPS data from his work truck. Chris worked for Anadarko Petroleum, and his company vehicle was equipped with a sophisticated telematics system that logged every movement, the ignition cycle, and stop. Chris had claimed he drove straight to a work site to conduct an inspection. The GPS data, however, painted a more specific and damning picture. It showed that he arrived at a remote site known as Survey 319 at roughly 6:53 a.m. It recorded that the truck remained idling for a significant period. It showed exactly where he went and how long he stayed. This data would later be correlated with the recovery of the victims, proving that science is often the most reliable witness in the room. Simultaneously, investigators were diving into the communication history of the couple. They recovered text messages that revealed a marriage in deep distress. While their social media portrayed a fairy tale romance, the private messages told a story of disconnection and heartbreak. Shanann had spent weeks in North Carolina visiting family earlier that summer. And during that time, Chris had become distant and cold. Shanann's texts to friends revealed her desperation to save the marriage, her confusion over his sudden change in behavior, and her willingness to do whatever it took to fix things. Chris's texts, conversely, were short, dismissive, and devoid of affection. The investigation then uncovered the catalyst for this emotional detachment: an affair. Digital forensics revealed that Chris had been seeing a co-worker. This discovery provided a potential motive. It suggested that Chris was not merely unhappy in his marriage, but was actively seeking a new life, a fresh start that he felt was encumbered by his current family. The concept of the family annihilator is a specific and terrifying psychological profile. And unlike domestic abusers who kill in a heat of rage, family annihilators often plan their crimes. They view their family not as loved ones, but as obstacles to a new identity or as financial liabilities. The psychology here is rooted in extreme narcissism, where the perpetrator's needs and desires completely eclipse the right to life of those around them. On August 15th, 2 days after the disappearance, the pressure on Chris Watts reached a breaking point. He agreed to a polygraph test at the police station. The polygraph, while not always admissible in court, is a potent investigative tool used to induce psychological stress and elicit confessions. The examination was conducted by Agent Tammy Lee of the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. The strategy was not one of intimidation, but of calculated silence and specific questioning. Chris failed the polygraph spectacularly, scoring a -18, where a score of -4 indicates deception. Following the failed test, the interrogation shifted gears. Agents Tammy Lee and Graham Coder utilized a technique that involves offering the suspect a socially acceptable reason for the crime to help them begin confessing. They suggested that perhaps Shanann had done something to the children, and that Chris had reacted in defense. It was a lifeline thrown to a drowning man, and Chris grabbed it. He admitted to killing Shanann, but falsely claimed it was because he saw her smothering their daughters. It was a lie, a final attempt to salvage some shred of his reputation. But it was the breakthrough investigators needed. He was now admitting to a homicide. With this admission, the search for the victims came to a tragic end. Chris directed investigators to the CER VI 319 oil site. The recovery process was a grim task that deeply affected every first responder involved. The body of Shanann Watts was found buried in a shallow grave. The bodies of 4-year-old Bella and 3-year-old Celeste were recovered from inside the large crude oil battery tanks nearby. The callousness of the disposal, separating the children from their mother and placing them in toxic oil tanks, stripped away any remaining doubt about the nature of the crime. This was not a moment of defensive rage. It was a calculated act of elimination. The autopsy results and forensic evidence gathered from the site and the home eventually forced Chris to abandon his partial confession. The medical examiner found no evidence that Shanann had harmed the children. The cause of death for all three victims was determined to be asphyxiation. The forensic analysis of the shadows on the neighbor's surveillance tape, combined with the GPS data and the autopsy findings, allowed prosecutors to construct a timeline that was practically irrefutable. The grim reality was that Chris had strangled his wife in their bed and then drove his daughters, who were still alive, to the oil site, where he ended their lives one by one. Faced with overwhelming evidence, including the discovery of the shadow walking towards the truck on the surveillance tape, which was likely one of the children, the GPS coordinates, the text messages, the affair, and his own failed polygraph, Chris Watts pleaded guilty to all charges on November 6, 2018. By entering a guilty plea, he avoided the death penalty, a condition the victim's family agreed to, not out of mercy for him, but to avoid the prolonged trauma of a trial. The sentencing hearing was a moment of profound sorrow and raw emotion. The courtroom was packed, the air heavy with the weight of the tragedy. The district attorney, Michael Rourke, laid out the facts with clinical precision, dismantling the good guy persona Chris had worn for years. But it was the victim impact statements that truly resonated with the world. Shanann's parents, Frank and Sandy Razuchek, stood before the man they had once treated as a son. Their words were not of vengeance, but of broken hearts and an enduring love for the daughter and grandchildren that they had lost. They spoke of Shanann's vibrancy, her battle with lupus, which she had fought so bravely, and her immense joy in being a mother. They reclaimed the narrative, ensuring that Shanann, Bella, and Celeste were remembered not just as victims, but as bright, beautiful lights that had been extinguished too soon. The judge, in his final remarks, noted the absolute inhumanity of the crime. He sentenced Chris Watts to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 48 years for the unlawful termination of a pregnancy and 36 years for tampering with a deceased human body. It was the maximum penalty allowed by law, ensuring that Chris Watts would never again walk free. The case of the Watts family murders remains a haunting chapter in the annals of criminal history because of the terrifying question it poses. How well do we truly know the people we share our lives with? And Chris Watts was not a man with a long criminal record. He was not a known abuser. He was, by all accounts, a quiet suburban father. Yet, beneath that mundane exterior lay a capacity for ultimate betrayal. The investigation succeeded because of a convergence of swift police work, community vigilance, and the undeniable truth of forensic science. The neighbor who shared his camera footage, the friend who refused to stop calling, the patrol officer who trusted his gut, and the detectives who meticulously unraveled the digital lies, all played a role in securing justice. Shanann Watts is remembered today not only for the tragedy of her death, but for the fullness of her life. She was a woman of ambition, resilience, and deep love for her children. The legacy of this case has also led to broader discussions about domestic violence, and the signs of coercive control, and the dangers of the family annihilator profile. It serves as a somber reminder that justice is not just about punishment. It is about uncovering the truth, no matter how painful, and ensuring that the voices of the silenced are heard. As we reflect on this case, we are left to consider the fragility of trust and the importance of looking out for one another. In a world where digital facades often mask reality, the instincts of a friend like Nickole Atkinson prove to be the difference between a cold case and a solved investigation. It compels us to ask ourselves, if someone we knew suddenly went silent, would we be the ones to knock on the door? The resolution of the Watts family murders brought a legal conclusion, but the emotional scars remain for the community of Frederick and the family left behind. It stands as a testament to the rigorous work of law enforcement and a memorial to a mother and her children who deserved a lifetime of tomorrows. The house on Saratoga Trail may stand silent now, but the story it holds continues to echo, a warning and a tragedy that the world will not soon forget.